Hello, this is FRJ Tracing with another part of the What the F equals MA series that I have going on here. This will be a look at the whole history of old tiers, boosts, and also new tiers, and some of the things that we can learn from some of the mechanics that were implemented back then versus now, and some of the things that, in my opinion, aren't really supposed to be in the game right now, and maybe the reasons on why some of these mechanics did and did not work. Alright, so the first section I want to talk about is the original tier system. So first we had 10 tiers in all, and you can see in each one of these subdivisions you branch out of all the parts that are within that tier. And the way that they describe the even number tiers versus the odd number, so you started at T1, then you got the T2, they would call them quote unquote S tiers. They're basically a slightly improved version of the tier before. So like the T2 is like the same model but like had little fins on it, and it was slightly better. So with that, you also had its own HP per CPU and mass per CPU. Now, if we look at just the building blocks, they've always been like one CPU cost back then, before we had TX. So then if you got a higher tier cube, then you would have more HP, more mass. But also, in addition to this, you would look at the volume of that, and there was like a ratio of mass to the volume of every shape. So the mass and the volume had a direct relationship. So for example, the triangular prism that was just like a half of a cube had half of the mass of the base cube. So if you look at the full cube, it had the full stats for like the T3 armor. Then the shapes had some kind of ratio of volume to mass. But then health points had followed their own curve, which they had to balance over a long amount of time, and it always seemed to give them trouble. But also it increased in complexity for every tier you had. So then you had a new curve and a new relationship for all these parts, and then you had that times 10 tiers. So the complexity of that was over, like if you had 12 shapes, then you already had 120 combinations. And then for every stat, if we're going to call mass and HP its own stat, you had 240 combination and balancing points. So what they ended up doing is setting a curve. Like if the part lays on this part of the curve, then it would have these stats. So they kind of figured it out, and that was good, but it still made a compounding complex part of the game. So a lot of people like the old tiers with their 10 tiers being there, but the part complexity and balancing provided not only a lot of depth, but also made it very difficult to balance in some ways than others. The other thing is that when you leveled up in the game by player level from 0 or level 1 to 100, you gained tech points and player level. And as you leveled up, you could get more CPU if you reached a certain player level. So your progress over time was a metric of CPU and how many tech points that you got, the parts that could satisfy your CPU limit. So for example, I think around T6 or T5 was about a 700 CPU bot. And you would go in, and if your bot was 700 CPU, then that's what tier you're going to be in. Now this got a little bit, it was easier because there wasn't many parts back then. There wasn't a lot of depth in building. They had like the basic rail, and they had basic plasma and basic SMG. I think that those were the first three, even from what I remember before nanos and all these other things. You had 3 guns to work with. You had the primary movement of wheels and hovers, and wings were kind of a thing, but like they were available after T5. So there wasn't a huge amount of depth, but the complex part was once they started adding more parts, you started multiplying the complexity for every tier. So it worked in the beginning, but then it started getting more and more complex and hard to balance. The other things that were here is that you had more mass equals less top speed. So they didn't have speed boost, and the way parts worked was like not only was your forces determining your acceleration, they kind of had F equals ma, but like if you're really heavy, you could barely reach top speed, and then as you started to use lighter cubes, like the small tetras, then you could get going really fast. Your CPU and the movements and everything like that, and how your speed worked was more like related to your mass, but also your actual speed was related to mass too. And I feel like there was a lot of confusion that created from that point on when we started getting speed boost and other mechanics, because what they set was if you're heavy, you're also slow in the sense that you actually cannot go a really high speed. But it also at the same time determined your acceleration. So it like in someone's mind when they were thinking of, oh, I want the old system back where heavy equals slow and light equals fast. That's not necessarily F equals ma. That's just how original movement worked. And then on top of that, you had diminishing returns and carry mass. Because of how that system worked with stacking components and redundancy, they ran into the issue where if you compounded the amount of thrust that you had, you would have this like linear relationship of multiplying force, which if you put thrusters on, you would get like an insane amount of thrust if you put like 10 thrusters on for redundancy. Well, what that ended up causing is like really insane speed and really broken mechanics in the context of the old speed system. So they had to create what was called diminishing returns. So after like X amount of parts, they don't add that much force. They're just redundancy. What this caused was a situation where your parts and their effective ability could not be quantified anymore because their balancing changed with how many of those parts you use. It changed the effectiveness after you reached diminishing returns. So I didn't like diminishing returns. I also didn't like carry mass, which is also a part of that system. They could have solved it in other ways, but the issue was that this was the way they fixed it, and it decoupled the stats that you see on the screen and what you actually experience after you passed a certain limit. And then carry mass was essentially, and still is, as I showed in my previous video, was once you reached X amount of mass for that part, your part starts to work on a different curve. So back then, like for example, wheels and hovers, you would be like completely fine, even though they kind of had more realistic physics. But like once you reached carry mass, then they would just they wouldn't work anymore, or they would like go slower. So like they would have the normally nominal speed, or they would have like overloaded speed. And that got a little convoluted in the sense that as long as you built right on the edge of the carry mass, so that singular point, that defined number, then you had a meta that pretty much was established around that point. You optimized for carry mass and you optimized for the movement speed at that point. So overall, the issue with diminishing returns and carry mass is that you could optimize it instead of having a trade-off system. So, and there was always like a singular point that you could kind of build around if you're looking at CPU costs and speed and mass. It took a little bit of time, but people could figure this out within a day. But that was the primary issue with that. And then the last thing is all guns have unique firing. So like instead of the energy bar system, you'd have a situation where like SMGs would fire in round robin, or rails would have an ammo system where you had to reload it, and then plasmas would shoot in like a singular volley, and then it would recharge like the energy system. So that was completely decoupled from a unified power bar. Every gun fired its own way. And because of that, and because of how it was designed, it didn't need, like, for example, when they established the power bar, and also when we had maximum loadout, before and after there was a glitch that you could do which wasn't possible in the old system. What you were able to do is basically switch between guns of different firing rate, and basically make a machine gun for that particular kind of gun type. So if it was an SMG and you just put all the different tier SMGs, you could create like a really fast machine gun by doing a macro switch on it. So they solved that problem for the power bar. But if you look at that same problem in the context of the old system for guns, it didn't have to exist because every gun followed its own rules. There was one situation where in maximum loadout, you could mix your tiers, and the bug was that it was called the HMG. You could put one like T10 gun on your bot, and then you put the little T1 guns as the rest of the loadout. And the issue with that was basically the way it worked is there was a time in between shots, and the little low tier guns had a very low time in between. And then once you reach 6 guns, you would have 5 guns that shot really fast and didn't do any damage. But then once it got to the SMG that was really big, the time that had passed in between the shot for the really big gun multiplied your DPS by some insane amount. So you pretty much had like a really fast shooting heavy machine gun for a T10 gun at the time. So they solved that with like another implementation in the energy system, but it existed in another form, but they didn't have to solve it because that wasn't a problem. They fixed it another way. The point is that the fundamental differences gave the guns a very unique feel, and now with maximum loadout, they all have to follow the same rules, and also they're easier to work with because they all follow a energy system. And then that's going to go right into boosts, so we'll talk about boosts next. So the next thing we had after maximum loadout and all those other things I talked about in the first tier's iteration was boosts. So we got boosts and everything changed. You got the damage boost system, you got the health boost system, and speed boost. So the idea behind this is that it's what's called a horizontal progression system. So when you go into a game, regardless of what level you are or what you have, you could, in theory, match with anyone and everyone. So you have effectively one tier. But the difference is that your bot performance is changed between these 3 things, and they have trade-offs that determine how your bot will be in that singular tier. So if you focus on like health boost, then that means you inherently have less speed boost and less damage per CPU, because as CPU went up, your damage went down. And if you used more CPU for health boost parts, then you would have less speed boost. So that's an example, but effectively you had these 3 balancing points. Where this becomes important is that you also had no F equals MA. So in my physics video that I made, back before that F equals ma, you could see how speed boost was, and I still think is a good system on managing speed, but there's no, you've lost that acceleration thing that the old system had. So the old system being that if you were heavy or you were slower, it also, when you were slower, you kind of accelerated and had less agility. But now that speed boost is like quantified with that system and a base speed and all that, the acceleration problem got really bad, and acceleration was near instant for all movement parts. There was no variation, and the mass didn't matter. So when mass started to not matter, they created what was called cube normalization, which actually is a good, it needs to be there for F equals ma, but for boosts it was there because, well, it didn't do anything in the first place. Having that variation of different shapes and mass didn't really do much except for carry mass. So, and why I mentioned it before is that, like, if you looked between this, essentially boost was about optimizing the three curves, and if you took a little bit of calculus or math, it was actually really easy to optimize where these curves, some were exponential and some were linear, and it just became a three-part systems of equations where you would find the most optimal build zone, and then your parts typically worked within that point very well. And that area of most optimal building was located around the 1500 to 1600 CPU mark, and it moved up and down depending on whatever they did at any given point in time. The other thing is that you had the energy bar system in full, and camera controls starting to get fully implemented with tilt. So what this started to do is, because of how this system worked with physics and like the new era in like everything needed to work with camera controls and center of mass assist, like comm assist, then everything started to kind of conglomerate into like one unified feeling game, and you lost the variation in how things felt. Like all the guns started to shoot the same, and then you had things move that were like heavily assisted. So like if you built something wrong, it would still kind of work for accessibility reasons. Actually, if you go look back, there was a streams called like the Yogs cast, and that was like a big thing when the game first started, that like they had like a stream, and it got really popular, and you could see one of the guys in there try to make a hover, and he was just so bad at it, but he really wanted to make a hover, and he didn't understand how it worked, but they still had a lot of fun, they still played. But that was a peer into how difficult it used to be to make hovers. But then they turned into this whole, like, if you stick a part under it like a rod, you can magically fly higher, and you'll have perfect balance for the most part. So essentially what Boost did is it optimize the curve game, plus everything is feeling the same, and camera controls had no cost, as well as speed boost, but no F equals ma. So overall, the system in theory looked really good because it simplified balancing and it made a general unified game, and also it didn't separate matchmaking. But at the end of the day, what it also did is, where a lot of new players would start out with low-tech parts and low CPU, they would get a lot of damage boosts per CPU, and they wouldn't have all these other things. However, that large damage and low tech of everything else, like low health and low speed boost, you've given them this really high damage, high reward system where they're also kind of at the mercy of being killed all the time. So time to kill was really low for newer players that didn't understand the mechanic, and then they were also doing a lot of damage, so they felt like they would feel OP, and they would think other parts felt OP in that range, because they didn't know if you built bigger, you would get more health or you could get more agile. Vice versa, if you were like a really experienced player and you had all the parts and you wanted to build like the biggest, coolest, baddest thing, well, you had to lose your damage for it. So you basically made this glorified heavy tank that has no firepower, or the thing that was arguably okay as a trade-off was like you could make a really fast bot. Again, no F equals MA, but then you wouldn't have the damage. And that was the big problem, is that there was a lot of speed planes and stuff back then. And the trade-off in low damage and running away, the auto heal and coming back was a very annoying thing to experience. But it was balanced in the sense that, yes, they didn't have a lot of damage and they didn't have a lot of health, but they could just run around being really annoying. So all these things played into little metas that were annoying to deal with, but they were quote unquote balanced. And then the camera control situations, because it was never balanced in context of gaining more, like, camera controls gives you 5 degrees of freedoms, with 2 of them being automated by the computer, whereas human input is limited to 4 degrees of freedom. And that's just checking a box, and it doesn't cost any CPU or anything. So that gave drones an advantage of... I'm not an anti-drone person in any sense, but the way that they were balanced didn't have a cost for the benefit that they obtained. So when they did balancing things that affected drones, they also made everything else really boring, or they ruined the other parts of the game. So to put in perspective, in the old tiers, drone pilots were like, when you got yourself wrecked by like an Invictus Rex clan flying all keyboard drones, you're like, oh man, I need to learn how to do that, because that was like really badass. But now it's like, oh, you could watch the last World Cup, and pretty much the point of view camera was probably, in my opinion, the most boring thing to watch ever, because it was just a camera controlled drone looking around shooting people, and the only thing that was really going on there that was slightly impressive was strategy. There was no like having impressive piloting skills and building skills. Like, pretty much you just had to like put something together that kind of worked, and then if you optimized everything around a singular point, you were good. But you didn't have to like systematically balance your, like, when I say balance, actually, like, if you put your part in one place versus somewhere else, it was negligibly different than if you just optimized all the boosts to that CPU range or whatever the meta was. So that was the big difference of boosts versus the old tiers. So the last thing that we have is the new tier system. So when you start looking at tiers now, they broke it down to 5 tiers. And now we have remnants of boosts with F equals MA, quote unquote, and then the energy bar system, which still has some balancing from the boosts era, but it's just applied now because it works. It's easy to work with, and overall that is what it is. They also changed the old 5 loadouts to 3. And then the final thing, which is very controversial, and here's some of my opinions on, is that so robot ranking is good. And how robot ranking used to work before in the first tiers, they tried it out for like a little bit right before boosts and later on in tiers, and I think they took it out because they couldn't get it to work originally. But the point is robot ranking solved the problem where if you had used this much CPU for a part for redundancy, sometimes that part effective functionality and its CPU cost didn't justify how much it cost for the robot ranking. So when you were matchmaking, the robot ranking determined how you matched other players. So like, for example, if you had a really basic bot with a lot of health cubes, and then you put like 100 CPU worth of wheels on there, then let's say they're like you put 100 CPU worth of like high tier, and then you put 100 CPU worth of low tier wheels on there. In the old system, it would say that that bot is effectively the same thing. But if you looked at how those parts were actually balanced, the 100 CPU worth of low tier parts for the wheels would go really slow, or it would like barely carry the mass that you have, or it would have a low health per CPU. And essentially, in that case, robot ranking leveraged that balancing and decoupled it from CPU balancing. So then create a situation where you can balance redundancy and the parts functionality without rebalancing the whole game. So like, for example, the idea was if this certain part was OP and it kept like in the mid tiers, like tier 3 to tier 5 in the old days, then in theory that part would just increase in robot ranking because it was more effective, and it would make you go up against more difficult bots. Where it became a little bit more difficult to balance was at the highest tier. That's where everything kind of goes amiss. It's like that's where parts need to be balanced respectively, as opposed to robot ranking stepping in, because that's when you max everything out, and then you have to have enough players to have robot rankings that are close to each other, because generally this number followed an exponential curve, whereas CPU limit followed a very linear curve, because if you have X amount of parts, then you have this X amount of CPU, whereas some of these parts that had like T5 versus T1, the robot ranking was an order of like 5, as opposed to just being twice as good, or just a little bit better if you look at their robot ranking per CPU. So when you looked at the robot ranking and how it went up, it had a different scale that it followed, and it basically combated the whole redundancy thing. But then we got this weapon rank and damage boost thing, which I know why they put it in there, and I can see what they're trying to do, but there's half of it that's a really big problem. So the weapon rank system is a good idea. It's just like robot ranking, but for your weapons. So if you're really good at a certain thing, notice that when you're in a game now and you look at the weapon ranks, then you can see that they're generally balanced between the two teams. Generally, it's a balancing mechanic for matchmaking. The problem is that you've now changed the damage output for that weapon rank, and that's a mess, because what you've effectively done is you've changed that part's ability and how it shows up in the matchmaker. And also because robot ranking doesn't change with weapon rank. So that's one of the first things I looked at. I was like, hold on a second. Do they realize what they've done? Because when you start changing that part's functionality and not changing its robot ranking, it ruins the point of that system. However, because they gave it its own weapon rank, I think that's how they tried to justify it. But in doing so, you create a situation where you have to level up and basically play the game to be effective. What happens, I stopped playing for a while, and even though I'm my high tier, or I've played for ages, my player level is 2800, and I have over 2500 hours of playing, I got in there, And because I didn't rank up my weapons, I was getting wrecked by everyone that had ranked up their weapons. But I was still matched with them because when you play in T5, you just have this whole conglomeration of whoever's leveled up the most. So that in conjunction to the CPU based system of like, if you can build up all full CPU and you have this much robot ranking, if robot ranking is not considered and weapon rank is with damage boost, then you can't balance one person to another because those things are ignored in the current matchmaking. So you have that plus quote unquote F equals MA, which isn't. I've already described it in the last video. You have an energy bar system, which again, weapons had their own way of feeling, but now they just feel like the same. Like if you use a rail versus a gun that's like an SMG or a plasma, they all feel the same. Another thing that I want to highlight is that they tried to emulate volley plasma by making the damage or the fire rate so high that it effectively fired like a volley. But what that did for a little bit in Boost era, and it drove me insane. But because they all tiers for the same gun, or all like whatever levels for guns, had the same fire rate, you had a situation where you only had different damage per CPU ranges. So then your DPS was, like for example, in the Boost era, you used to have a really high fire rate and low damage, but over time you would still do this similar DPS to a big gun that's fired slow and did a lot of damage each shot. But then when they tried to emulate volley plasma, they eliminated that and essentially made it vertical, like a tier system. So that didn't work in Boost, but then now it kind of works now. But that highlights why they had to make this change to plasma with the fire rate thing. Them trying to emulate an old system just doesn't work. So then they had to backpedal and try to make it work in the energy bar system. So a big drawback to this is the energy bar system and then this damage boost with weapon rank. Those are really bad. And then the icing on the cake is tier banding. So I'm going to get into the whole matchmaker thing after this, but what tier banding does is essentially you'll see a tier 4 person in T5, or you'll see a tier 2 and tier 1 or tier 3. Now, what tier banding did was essentially, before AI, allowed players to fill a match faster without waiting forever, but at the cost of the player experience and at the cost of a balanced game. What it also did now with AI is that it's leveraging tier banding instead of using AI. However, I've still seen in a full tier 5 match a situation where they had a tier banded AI that what's it, the Twitch guy, that random Twitch guy, whatever, that AI that has that name was a T4 in a full T5 match, and he didn't have any weapon rank or damage boost. He was just there as a T4, and it didn't make any sense because it wasn't like our team had a lot of it wasn't like our team had like a lot of robot ranking or weapon ranking to offset the low tier AI. If you looked at the other team versus our team, we were pretty well balanced, and it was a lot of people that I recognized. So there's still like a huge disparity in the matchmaker's ability to even utilize tier banding for its intended purpose. And then with AI, it creates a whole other level of randomness to the matchmaker that makes it really hard to balance. So like there's part balance and then there's matchmaking balance. And what this does is the damage boost just completely ruins that. So in my next video, I'm going to be taking everything talked about here and in the first video of the series and essentially using that as a lessons learned. We need to change certain things to move towards a better Robocraft overall, and this can include everything from game balance to matchmaking and major mechanical changes that need to be looked at. There's too many issues that are very minute and are spread out very thin across every aspect of the game. And so that's why I believed it's taken 3 videos in a series to get here. And so I hope that we can make a better Robocraft.
Well, if you like what you see, please drop me a like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. And I hope I can provide some more Robocraft related content that you can enjoy, and hopefully we can turn this around.